Welcome to Walking Through the Word. I am Josiah Espinoza. Today we'll be reading John chapter 10, starting at verse 1 all the way through verse 6. So if you have your Bibles, open them with me as we walk through the Word together. Last time we saw Jesus in John chapter 9 opening the eyes of a blind man, of a man that was born blind, and the Jews and the Pharisees were questioning why this individual had been born blind. Was it the sin that he had committed, or was it the sin that his parents had committed? And Jesus says, neither. And so, after Jesus opened the eyes of the blind man, the Jews were questioning whether or not this individual was truly this blind man. And they brought this blind man to the Pharisees. So it seemed like it was a pretty well-known miracle that had taken place amongst the community. It wasn't just something that was hidden, it was actually something very public. The Jews recognized this, the Pharisees saw this happening, and then at the very end, we see that the blind man worships Jesus in front of the crowd, in front of the Jews, and in front of the Pharisees. And we know this to be the fact because when Jesus at the verse 39 says, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." It says in verse 40, "Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, 'Are we also blind?'" So Jesus performed this miracle in public. The Jews, there was a crowd, there were the Pharisees present. And Jesus' last words in chapter 9 says this, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say, 'We see,' your guilt remains." So Jesus, in this next portion in John chapter 10, is still addressing both the crowds and the Pharisees for their lack of belief in who Jesus was in the miracle that he had just performed. Listen to what he says in verse 1. "Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber." Now remember, he's primarily addressing the Pharisees. And the Pharisees saw themselves as leaders of the community, as people who taught the community according to the Old Testament law. And we just saw that the Pharisees casted out this blind man from the synagogue, from the place of teaching. And so when Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber," he's saying, you individuals, you Pharisees, you elite religious leaders, you are trying to rob the sheep. You're trying to come into the house where my sheep are, and you're trying to take them away. And verse 2 says, "But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep." So just imagine for a moment, in the field, there is this closed off land or closed off pasture that's surrounded by a gate, by a fence. And those individuals that rob the sheep, those individuals that end up stealing the sheep, do not enter by the gate. They don't enter by the doorway of the sheepfold. They enter through another way so that they can steal the sheep. They don't do it legitimately. They do it falsely. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep, obviously, because he either has the key to be able to open it, he has access to it, he has authority to open it because it's his sheepfold. It's his location where his sheep are. And look at what it says in verse 3. "To him the gatekeeper opens." Who is him? First of all, who is the one who enters by the door? Well, obviously it's Jesus. Jesus is the true shepherd. And to him, the gatekeeper, who is the gatekeeper? Well, obviously the Father. Because Jesus again and again has mentioned that the Father is the one who sent him. The Father is the one who testifies of him. The Father is the one who is one with him. When Jesus is working, the Father is working. Whatever the Father says, Jesus says. And so the gatekeeper is the Father. and the Father opens the gate to his Son. So, in other words, he gives him access to the sheep. And listen to what it says. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. So there's a place full of sheep. But even within this place full of sheep, there are the sheep that are known by name. And of course, this is an illustration of Jesus to the community, to the whole world, basically. The whole world is full of people. And there's humanity. But within humanity, Jesus has his own people that he knows by name. Listen to what he says. The sheep hear his voice. So there is a group of people, or there is a flock of sheep within the sheepfold that recognize the voice of the shepherd. And when he calls out his own sheep, he calls them out by name. And those he calls out by name, and those that recognize his voice, he leads them out. Okay? So in verse 4 it says, when he has brought all of his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. So Jesus calls his sheep, the sheep follow the shepherd, and the shepherd leads the sheep, and the sheep follow the shepherd, because they know him, they know his voice. Verse 5, a stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. Jesus is known to his people, and the elect people know the voice of the shepherd. How? Because the Father draws his sheep by name. If you want to get into more specific references, you go to Ephesians chapter 1, Romans chapter 8, Romans chapter 9. God has predestined his elect people to himself. And when he calls his people, he calls them out by name. And they know his voice, and they follow his voice. And they will not listen to the voice of a stranger. They will follow the voice of their shepherd. Look at what it says in verse 6. This figure of speech Jesus used with them. And listen, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. What does that mean? If they don't understand, Jesus just told them, I'm the shepherd. My sheep hear my voice. They will follow me. I call them out by name. And if I call them out by name, I'm going to lead them. They're going to follow me. And I am going to be their shepherd. They're going to be my sheep. I'm going to be their God. They're going to be my people. And Jesus uses this as a figure of speech. And what happens? They don't understand. Why? Because they're not his sheep. And you might be asking yourself, am I part of the fold of God? I pray that you be you, and that you be experiencing the drawing of the Father to the Son. Just as it says in verse 6, God grants that you come to the Son. God gives to the Son those whom he draws. It's not by our own merits. It's not by our own abilities. The Father alone gives grace and faith to those whom he has elected for his own glory and purposes. So I pray this message has been a blessing to you. I pray that you are experiencing that draw of the Father, that you would heed the voice of the shepherd, and that you would follow the fold of God that is being led by the preeminent Messiah, the Christ, the shepherd, the one who is leading us into salvation. May the Lord richly bless you, and until next time on Walking Through the Word.